Yes. Should I start?
Yeah. Does it say your live?
Yeah, it says.
Brilliant. I can see you. Please start. Thank you so much.
And since all of us have been at home for a long period of time, I'm guessing some of those conflicts might come up. I really hope they didn't turn ugly. And if it did, one thing I would like to assure you is by the end of this session, you will have certain skills and techniques which will definitely help you resolve them better from now on. So moving on to conflicts. The thing about conflicts in our culture is that it's considered very negative. It's almost as if an indication that something has gone wrong. And that is a myth that I want to bust today. Because conflicts actually are, in fact, studies even suggest that conflicts bring people together, closer together. They strengthen the bonds. Don't believe me? Well, you will by the end of this session. So why am I saying conflicts are healthy? It's because firstly, it's impossible to not have conflicts in any relationship because it's just not possible for two people to agree on everything all the time, isn't it? We are all different individuals, and hence we are bound to clash. We are bound to have disagreements, and they're okay. As long as you know how to resolve it in a better way, you are going to be just fine. So please remember, the key is not to avoid conflict. It is, in fact, to resolve these conflicts in a healthier manner. So before we move on to these strategies, I just want you to take a moment and think about your automatic reaction to conflicts. So just take that moment to recollect the last time you had a conflict coming. How did you really react? Yeah, I'm just going to wait. Take that moment, remember it. If you need some help, I can give you examples. So there are some of us who are very uncomfortable with the conflict, so much so that we go out of our way to avoid them. So either we suppress our emotions or we give in to the other person's just so that we don't have to deal with it. Yeah. There are also some of us who get very overwhelmed with conflicts. And in that process, they end up yelling and shouting and losing that control over themselves and their emotions. There are also some of us who take conflicts very, very personally, and hence they end up overreacting to situations. Well, whatever your go-to strategy might be till now, just try and reflect whether they are healthy or sustainable in the long run. Chances are that you are not following these healthy. I mean, your techniques are not necessarily healthy because because in India, we follow these very unhealthy patterns when it comes to conflict resolution, which is why it's considered negative in the first place. So we've gotten into this habit and pattern of these things, which is why we keep passing it to the next generation. So chances are that your children may also take on to your strategies, because children emulate. And quite possibly your own strategies are also these strategies that you have picked up from your parents, when you were growing up. So if you want your children, and I'm guessing most of you are parents who are watching me, so if you want your children to learn healthier techniques to resolve conflicts, then it's important that you follow suit as well, that you first learn it and be role models for them. So let's move on to these strategies that I'm talking about. I think it will help if you look at these steps, these strategies as steps into conflict resolution. So the first point, let's call it the first step, is I call it the power of pause. Yes. So whenever you notice a conflict coming your way, be it inside you when you notice an emotion, or there is a trigger in the environment, or there's somebody who's approaching you with a dispute, um, pause before you respond. A short pause will help you gain that emotional control so that you respond rather than react. And there's a big difference between the two. Reaction is when we go with the flow. We are not in control of the way we react. But response is something which is a choice that we make. So wouldn't you rather have a choice to really respond how you want to respond rather than just react in the emotional flow. Yeah. So take that time to pause. It's a time is a very precious thing, and time also seems to dilute that intensity of the emotions that you might be feeling. Uh, and time also gives you, like, taking that pause also gives you that space to breathe, to gain perspective and practice self-control. So let your feelings indicate that something is happening, but take that time to pause so that you won't let those feelings dictate how you choose to respond. So pause and try to understand where that person is coming from. Pause. Don't immediately judge the situation or the person. Pause, because by reacting quickly, you will move into fight or flight mode, which we do not want. Pause, maintain your control, and if someone else is being unreasonable, it doesn't mean you need to follow suit. Pause and slow down. Pause and choose how you want to respond. Now, moving on to the second step, or my second point, and I call it zoom out to gain perspective. So imagine that you are viewing the conflict from a neutral place, at a greater distance, almost like as if you're watching a movie, and you are a witness to that movie. So by doing that, you will realize that you get a very fresh perspective on that issue. Because when we are inside that situation, we are very preoccupied by how we feel and how we are looking at that situation. And when we come out of it, we are able to gauge it from a more unbiased point of view. So having that unbiased point of view will help you to be rational and be logical in your approach to conflict resolution. Yeah. And while you are zooming out and taking that perspective, also try and recognize whether are you really addressing the right person. Because a lot of times we end up displacing our emotions. So we are angry with someone else, but we are taking it out on someone else. It happens, and I'm sure you all know that. But it happens more often than we usually think it happens, and a lot of times we are not aware when it's happening. So just take that moment to reflect and see whether you're addressing the right person. Are you really is the person that you are trying to talk to, is he really the person who is making you feel all of those strong emotions? Yeah. And also try and identify whether that is the real issue or not. Because again, this is something that we do most of the time, is that we instead of addressing what our real core issues are, we address these surface level issues. Maybe because addressing those core issues mean a lot of effort, or it may take a lot of our energy and emotions, so we just end up avoiding that and dealing with surface level issues which do not matter so much. So when you are doing that, it's important that you deal with the core issue first, because unless you deal with that, the surface level issues will keep coming up, and resolving them is not going to resolve the core issue. For example, instead of arguing with your partner about leaving the toilet seat up, when your core issue actually is that you're feeling unsupported and lonely, that argument is not going to help. So deal with that core issue first. Now let's move on to the third step. Once you have recognized what the issue is, you have taken that pause, you have gained some perspective. Now the step is to communicate it with the other person, right? And as basic as communication may sound, but unfortunately, it is not one of our strengths. Especially, people in our country, communication is not our strength, because most of us are oscillating between the extremes when we are communicating. So either we are in this passive place where we end up suppressing our emotions, giving in to the other person, being submissive, or we are on the other extreme spectrum, which is we are aggressive and we end up yelling and shouting and being hostile when we are trying to convey something to the other person. So we just don't know how to be in this middle place. And this middle place, psychologists call it assertive way of communicating. So this essentially means that you are, expressing your point of view to the other person clearly and calmly, without either being too passive or being too aggressive. So there are various resources on assertiveness available online. So if you want to delve deeper into it, you can check that out. You can even get in touch with me post this session, and I will share some of these resources with you. So yes, so communicate assertively. And now I'm going to give you some hacks, how you can make that communication even better. So one hack is, using empathy statements. And empathy statements immediately show acknowledgement. And when people are in distress, what they are really looking for and what they really need is acknowledgement. In fact, a lot of those conflicts arise because people, what they really want is, that sense of validation, that sense of acknowledgement. And the moment you give it to them, the conflict is resolved already. Yeah. So acknowledgement does not mean that you're agreeing with that person, all right? It just means that you get it, that you get where that person is coming from, you understand where that person is coming from. And some of the great empathy statement starters are something like, I'm sorry, so I'm sorry to hear that, I'm sorry about your situation, about your experience. Or something like, I understand, I understand what you're saying, your situation, your frustration. I understand that you do not feel supported right now. And now coming to the next empathy statement, and this is something which really changes the zone from me versus you to making it like a team, and you versus the problem. And that is starting with let us. So let us work together to develop a plan to figure this out. Or let us talk about what support you might need. So you see this, it automatically changes it and makes you and the other person a team against this problem that you need to solve. Another communication hack is using I statements. It may seem very simple, but this for me versus I want you to do this for me. Is there a difference? I bet you can see the difference. The first statement sounds very commanding, isn't it? It sounds like I'm giving you an order, do this for me. Versus when I say, I want you to do this for me, it sounds more like a request. So do you realize you're saying the same thing, but just by adding that I just changes so much in that statement, that tone of the statement. So use I statements as much as you can. It really works wonders. And now coming to another important aspect is, being action focused instead of being person focused. And what I essentially mean by that is, instead of labeling the person, it'll be more helpful if you really state the behavior about that person that you do not like. For example, instead of saying that you are so lazy, saying that I don't like when you throw your socks around, can you please put it in the basket? Yeah. So when you say that you are so lazy, or when you label that person, it automatically makes that person feel very, very attacked. Won't you feel that if I say that to you? You are so this, you are so that. Yeah. So we feel very attacked, and hence we become very defensive in that process. And when we become defensive, we start to blame. Either we'll blame you or blame others, blame the situation. And that's how the conflict will never get resolved. It will just not lead to anywhere. So try and be as specific about the behavior as you can, and stay away from labeling the person or attacking the person. Yeah. So focus on the action, the behavior, rather than the person. And it will also help if you add the feeling aspect to it, which is, if you state how the other person's behavior is making you feel. I'll give you an example. So instead of saying that you're such a loud person, you don't know how to talk, saying that when you talk loudly, it makes me feel scared. So I would like it if you can speak softer. So here you are literally telling the other person the consequences of their actions. And hence it's more likely that the person is going to change the behavior, because if he or she cares about you, he will know that how it's making you feel. So these were some of the communication hacks. I hope it's not feeling too heavy. Uh, Moving on to the simpler aspects. But before we move on, all of these hacks, remember, are going to work only if you are doing this basic thing, which is listening. And as simple as it may sound, and you'll be like, oh, of course I listen, but more often than not, we are not listening. We are hearing, yes, but we are not listening. And this tends to be a generation problem. Like our generation, we just do not like to listen. And especially when it comes to a conflict, we are just so full of thinking about the next argument that we want to bring in, or thinking about the next thing we have to say, that we are just not listening to the other person and their point of view. And which is why, if we are not listening to the other person, how are we going to resolve this conflict together? It's impossible, right? So please listen to what the other person is saying, listen to what their perspective is. Whether you agree with it or not, it's fine. You can agree to disagree. But if nothing else, it will also help you to not resent the person in the process. Because when conflicts happen, we start to get very negative about the other person. So the moment we know where they are coming from, we'll be able to empathize more and possibly not resent them. So now moving on to my fourth step, which we can call it, think of it as resolving and not winning. And this is something that we do it all the time. We think of conflicts as fights that needs to be won, as war that we need to win. But conflicts are just a problem that we need to solve together. So please remember that, it's not a me versus you thing. And it doesn't have to be, that improving that you are right or wrong, because it's never about that. It's just a problem that you need to solve together. So do not make everything a competition. Who is working harder, how many times one person has cleaned the trash. You get the picture, right? So and while you're doing that, you're trying to resolve a conflict, often what happens is that we start to deviate and we start to dig up old things that might be lying around. So you are talking about maybe cleanliness, and you end up going on a different tangent and talking about what 10 years ago happened. So so whether you are doing it or the other person is doing it, whenever you recognize that you are moving off the tangent or you are losing the focus, just try and bring the focus back to the issue at hand by just saying that, okay, let's come back to the issue at hand, which is la la la. And, and if you feel that any discussion has become too intense, it may be appropriate to take a time out. That doesn't mean you do not come back and talk about it, because it's important to address the issue. So do not push it under the carpet. Do talk about it, but maybe talk about it when you both of your parties are calmer and cooler and have more emotional control. Yeah. Now, coming to my fifth and final point, which I call it collaborate and or compromise. So, of course, the end goal of the problem, end goal of the conflict is to resolve it, which is, finding a solution that makes all the parties happy, which is like a win-win for all of us, and it satisfied all of us. So, of course, if you can do that, if you can come with solutions that can make all of you happy, of course do that. Brainstorm until you get there. But there are certain times when that is not possible. Not It's not possible to come to a solution which will make everybody happy all the time. There will be problems to which we may not have that kind of a solution. So then it becomes essential to come to a compromise. So rather than dragging the conflict, it is more helpful if you can come to some sort of a compromise, rather than again dragging it to just get your way. Yeah. In fact, even Dr. John Gottman, and he happens to be one of the most renowned couple therapists, he talks about compromise, being in art. So he says that while it may not seem perfect, because everybody gains something and loses something in a compromise, but if you think about it, it just means that you are working together to find some common ground, and it will in fact leave you both feeling valued, respected, and supported. And isn't that what all of us want? Feel supported and valued. Yes. So when nothing works out, compromise is actually a great thing. It's not a negative thing, so think about that. So with that, these were my 5 steps to resolving a conflict. If you want a quick revision, I can just say it from the beginning, which is, number 1 is pause before you react. Yeah. The second is, um, moving out, zooming out, and gaining that perspective. The third point is communication and using those hacks that I talked about when you are trying to express something to the other person. And my fourth point is thinking of it as resolving and not winning. And the fifth one is the final one, which is either you collaborate together and think of a solution that fits all, or else, you come to some sort of a compromise. Yes. So now, if you have any questions, I'm free to answer all of your questions. So feel free to ask them right now. So I can see some of you have written many questions, which is how can we, there is this question by Rishabh, and he says, how do we remind ourselves of the pause, given most of the time we get overwhelmed by emotions and there is little time to pause and reflect? So I think that's a very interesting question, Rishabh. And what I have to say is that it comes as a habit. Of course, initially it will not come automatically to you, and you will have to practice it and consciously take that pause. But once you start doing that, you will realize that it becomes a new habit. And you will realize that most often than not, you will end up taking that pause without having to do so very consciously. I hope that answers the question. Next question is by Malka Agarwal. And her question is, how do we deal with a stubborn child? She's written stubborn beta, and I'm guessing that's your child. So stubbornness, that's a very interesting thing as well. Why do we consider stubborn as a negative thing? It can be a positive thing as well. It may not be completely wrong. Stubborn essentially means that you are sticking to what you believe in. You're not giving in. So if that's the case, if your child is actually very clear about what he or she wants and is very empathetic, very empathic about it, and saying it that this is what I want, that's actually a great quality and will take him a long way in life, because it's really important to be very standing up to what we really want rather than giving in for most times. So stubbornness can be a great thing, but if you're talking about that he or she is stubborn and not willing to listen to other people's perspective, so that's something that you can probably help your child out by telling him to stick to what he really wants, but also hearing out the other person's perspective. So, it basically means teaching your child to listen. And you can also do so by being a role model yourself, because children learn a lot by seeing how other people are doing it. So next time when you are being stubborn about something, show it to your child that even though you might stick to what you want, you can still do that by hearing other person's perspective. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Another question is, how could you, is by Siddharth, and he is asking that, can you give some insight on self-conflict issues as well? Wow, I think that's a very interesting question. Conflicts that, I think what you mean is conflict that you have within yourself, that you have with yourself. So my answer to that is, I think it can be very difficult to deal with it by your own self because the conflict is within you. So it can really help if you can take some professional help. So feel free to ping us, over a cup of tea. You can log into our website and take an appointment. And our therapists will love to take you through it by helping you resolve one of those conflicts. Let me see if there are more questions. I think there are a lot of, instead of questions, there are a lot of comments. So thank you for that. I see a lot of amazing comments that awesome, and that you guys have liked my presentation, my session. So great. In case any other questions come up or prop up, feel free to write to me. My email ID is info@overacupoftea.in. And what I'll do is I'll drop a file, a PDF file of this session, just pointers in one of these comment sections so that you can go back to it. So any other questions, feel free to ping me later. All right. So see you then. Have a really nice rest of the quarantine days. I'll see you next Friday again with another fresh topic. Bye bye.